Okay, guys, we're going to go over human reproduction, which is pages 688 to 691. So make sure you're obviously highlighting, taking good notes. We'll be wrapping up the human body after we talk about the development of a baby in the next section. So this is kind of the part where it seems a little weird to be going over human reproduction over video, but you'll want to make sure that if you have any questions, you can email me or when we're doing our class meeting next week, you can ask questions anonymously if you're not comfortable. But we're going to go over the male and the female reproductive system. So we're going to start with the male reproductive system. First, we have the testes, which are the main organ of the male reproductive system. This is where the sperm, which have to make it to the egg, are produced in the testes, and also testosterone, which is a part of, as we've mentioned in the endocrine system, part of the hormones that are produced in both actually males and females. Males typically have more testosterone, but the testes are important for that. Then, of course, we have the penis, which is the organ that transfers the sperm to the female. And so it also carries urine out of the body. So it is part of the urinary system as well, because that's where the urethra takes the urine out of the body. But it's the main organ that transfers the sperm into the female. Then we have what's called the epididymis. So after the sperm leave the testes, it gets stored into the epididymis. You may not know this, but the male body is actually too warm for sperm to survive. And so that's why the testes are located away from the body a little bit. Now, the sperm wouldn't be able to swim to the egg if they were not mixed with fluid, which is called semen. And that happens in the vas deferens. So here's a picture of the male reproductive system and the parts that we just mentioned. One gland that males have that females don't have is the prostate gland, and that is located within the organs of the male reproductive system in here, and they give fluid to the sperm, and so they're important too. One thing we mentioned way back earlier this year when we talked about cells and mitosis and meiosis is that sperm are produced daily. So males produce sperm daily, and they are living their life cycle and then being reproduced every single day. We'll talk about the female eggs, the female reproductive parts, but that's a lot different. So remember that when we talk about the daily production of sperm versus how eggs are produced in just a minute. So these are the male parts. You can kind of see them on here. Parts of the urinary system are in there as well. So the female reproductive system, some of these terms are going to sound familiar because we talked about them with other types of living things, like, for example, plants earlier this year. So the ovaries are obviously what makes the eggs. That should sound familiar to us from when we studied plants. Now, I mentioned that sperm are produced every day in males. Eggs, on the other hand, when a female baby is born, they have all the eggs that they're ever going to have at birth. And so eventually they don't produce eggs or have eggs anymore, and females can no longer have children, whereas males will typically produce sperm from puberty on for the rest of their lives. So the female hormone that's produced from the endocrine system is called progesterone, and that controls the release of eggs. During puberty, eggs start to be released, and that process will be able to prepare a woman to potentially release an egg and have it be fertilized. The vagina is what connects the outside of the body with the uterus, and that is where the baby travels through as well. So the uterus is pretty functional throughout a female's life, but mostly its job is to have the embryo, that young baby, embed itself and develop into a fetus and a growing baby at some point. So the uterus actually gets much larger when there's a pregnancy. Now, when females ovulate, they go through a process called ovulation. That's when the egg is released from the ovary, and it can be fertilized by sperm if it's present. Now, this is interesting. Ovulation only takes place around 1 or 2 days a month. So typically, females only can become pregnant 1 or 2 days a month. So the egg is released and it sits in the fallopian tube, and if a sperm doesn't fertilize it, it eventually dissolves. But if a sperm fertilizes it, it travels from the fallopian tube and develops in the uterus typically. So if the egg is not fertilized, I said it dissolves. Another process, which isn't the same thing, and sometimes people get mixed up, is the menstrual cycle or menstruation. So if the egg isn't fertilized, that uterine lining, that uterus doesn't have to prepare for a baby, and so it sheds. And this happens for about 5 days after you hit puberty in females. And a lot of people call it your monthly period, where the blood and the tissue come out, and you have your period for about 5 or so days. And it gets rid of that tissue that you don't need, that thickening of the uterus, and the unfertilized egg is flushed away. So if you have your period, you know that you are not having a developing baby in there, and that lasts for about 5 days a month. So ovulation is when the egg is released. Your period is when that egg isn't fertilized. It dissolves, and so does the thickening of the uterine lining. So it might sound a little foreign to some people, especially males, because they don't go through it, but also females, maybe that has not occurred. It occurs sometime usually between 5th, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, even as you get into high school. You may not have experienced that yet. So the female reproductive system is here. The uterus is a lot bigger if there's a developing baby here. And this is the area that the baby would come out, obviously, if it were what we call a vaginal delivery, which we'll talk about. You can see some of the parts of the urinary system here, the urethra, the bladder, and so on and so forth. Right here is the fallopian tube. That's where the egg during ovulation is released from the ovary. And it is where fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube, and it travels down to the uterus. So there can be problems of the reproductive system, just like we talk about other disorders and diseases in the other systems. Sometimes you can have what are called sexually transmitted diseases. That is from sexual contact. Things like HIV, AIDS, and herpes can occur. And then, of course, there can be cancers in any of those parts, right? So you can have prostate cancer, cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, any of those types of cancers. All that means is that the cells are uncontrolled, they're growing out of control, and you get what's called a tumor sometimes. And then we mention infertility because that is a reproductive system concern. It can happen in males and females. So sometimes people, for one reason or another, can't produce offspring. And sometimes it's because, for example, the sperm aren't developed, or the egg isn't in the fallopian tube, or females may not ovulate, or males may have other concerns. So that's a term that we use when it comes to, for some reason or another, a male or a female may not be able to have the reproductive system working. So that's the reproductive system. Hopefully you, if you have any questions, can email me or ask me. And if you need to go back, but we'll finish up with this week.